For 2,000 years, one name has shaped the world like no other, Jesus of Nazareth. But was he a real man who actually walked the earth? Or is he a powerful myth, a story created long after the fact? Well, in this explainer, we're going to dig into what history can actually tell us.
So let's just get right to it. Was Jesus a real, historical person? I mean, it's a huge question, right? So much of our world, our history, our culture, it all spins around this one person. So did he actually exist?
Now, you'd think this would be one of the biggest debates in all of history. But here's the surprising part. Among professional historians, it's not really a debate at all. The answer is actually incredibly clear.
Okay, so to get what's going on, we have to look at how historians even approach this topic. This isn't about faith or religion for them. It's all about method. And the first thing they do is make a really important distinction.
They basically split the question in two. On one side, you've got the Jesus of history. That's the guy that historians, using their standard tools, feel they can actually reconstruct, a Jewish teacher from Nazareth living in the 1st century. Then on the other side, you have the Christ of faith. This is the religious figure, Son of God, miracle worker, the resurrected Lord. For mainstream historians, their job is to focus only on the Jesus of history. The Christ of faith, they'll tell you that's a question for theology, not history.
So, what can they say for sure about this Jesus of history? Well, it boils down to two facts that have what scholars call almost universal assent. First, he was baptized by John the Baptist. Second, he was crucified by the Romans under Pontius Pilate. Now, why are they so sure about these two things? It's something called the criterion of embarrassment. Basically, the early Christians would have had no reason to make this stuff up. Why invent a story where your perfect leader needs a baptism for the forgiveness of sins? And why would you ever invent the most shameful, humiliating death imaginable, crucifixion, for your supposed Messiah? You just wouldn't. It's too embarrassing.
Okay, but what about the other side of the coin? There's a theory out there, you've probably seen it online, that says Jesus never existed at all. It's called the Christ myth theory. And we've got to understand what it is, and, more importantly, where it fits in the world of academic history.
So the core idea here is really simple. Jesus was never a real guy. Proponents, often called mythicists, argue that he's a purely mythological figure, kind of like Hercules or Osiris, and that the whole of Christianity was built on a story, not a person.
The case for this theory usually stands on three main pillars. First, you have to completely throw out the New Testament as having any historical value whatsoever. Second, the claim is that there are 0 non-Christian sources from the 1st century that even mention Jesus. And third, the whole story of Jesus was just borrowed from older pagan myths about dying and rising gods.
So how does this hold up? Well, to put it bluntly, it doesn't. In the academic world, the Christ myth theory is considered a fringe idea that was pretty thoroughly debunked over a century ago. As the famous historian Michael Grant says here, basically no serious professional scholar in the field today argues that Jesus didn't exist. It's just not a going concern in academia.
So if the myth theory is a non-starter, why are historians so confident that Jesus was real? Well, it all boils down to the evidence, specifically the early and independent sources we have.
This timeline really puts it all in perspective. Jesus is crucified around 30 AD, but look how quickly the first sources pop up. The letters of the Apostle Paul start showing up just 15 or 20 years later, and this is the kicker. Paul writes that he personally knew Jesus' brother, James, and his top disciple, Peter. That's an unbelievable link directly to the inner circle. And it doesn't stop there. Within about 60 years, you get non-Christian sources, like the respected Jewish historian Josephus and the Roman historian Tacitus also mentioning him.
So you see, it's not just 1 or 2 mentions. We're talking about a whole web of independent sources. You have the Christian sources, like Paul in the Gospels, which historians treat as a type of ancient biography. And you have the non-Christian sources, like Josephus and Tacitus. But you know what might be the most powerful piece of evidence? For centuries, critics of Christianity, Jews, pagans, Romans who hated the new religion, they argued against it constantly. But not a single one of them ever said, hey, this guy you're all obsessed with never even lived. They took his existence for granted, they just argued about who he was.
So here's the big question then. If pretty much every historian agrees Jesus was a real person, why is he still so controversial? Well, that's because the real argument was never about history. It's about theology.
For Judaism, for example, the theological problem is massive. At the absolute heart of Jewish faith is the idea that God is one, period, indivisible, singular, unique. So the Christian idea of a man who is also God, or a God in three persons, is seen as a fundamental contradiction of that core belief.
And then you have the whole issue of the Messiah. In Jewish tradition, there's a pretty clear checklist for what the Messiah is supposed to do. He's supposed to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, rule as a king, bring about an age of world peace. You get the idea. But if you look at the historical life of Jesus, from a Jewish theological perspective, he just doesn't check the boxes. The temple was destroyed after he died. He was executed, not crowned king. Wars continued. It's a theological mismatch.
And that brings us to the final layer of this whole thing. It's a philosophical battle. The way a historian deals with the supernatural stuff, the miracles, the resurrection, it all comes down to the basic assumptions they have about how the world works.
A lot of modern scholarship operates on a principle called naturalism. It's basically the idea that the physical, natural world is all there is. There's no supernatural, no divine intervention. So if you start with that as your non-negotiable premise, what happens when you read about a miracle? Well, it's impossible, by definition.
And this quote from the scholar Gerd Ludemann really says it all. If your historical method starts with the rule that God can't intervene in history, then you will of course never find any evidence that God has intervened in history. The conclusion is baked in from the very beginning.
So this leaves you with two totally different ways of looking at the Gospels. The first way, the naturalistic filter, just assumes miracles are impossible, so any story about one must be a myth or a lie made up later. But there's another way to look at it. Instead of starting with an assumption, you can start with a question. What is the best explanation for the things we do know happened? How do you explain the rise of this tiny movement into a world religion? How do you explain the fact that Jesus' disciples went from hiding in fear to boldly proclaiming his resurrection, willing to die for that belief? Something must have happened. The historical question is, what was it?
So what's the bottom line here? Let's just quickly recap. First, the consensus among historians is overwhelming. Jesus was a real historical figure. Second, the key to understanding the debate is the line drawn between the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith. And finally, the really big arguments aren't about whether he existed, but about theology and the philosophical glasses historians wear when they look at the past.
It really leaves us with a fascinating final thought, doesn't it? When you're dealing with a figure like this, where history and faith are so deeply intertwined, how do you even draw the line between what we can prove and what has to be believed? Where does one end and the other begin?